The hallway on the third floor of Riverside General smelled like disinfectant and fluorescent light. Marcus Hale was mopping the same stretch of tile he had mopped every morning for 3 months, when Director Pauline Graves rounded the corner with 2 administrators behind her. She stopped, looked at him the way people look at furniture they are tired of rearranging. Then she said it loudly enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "You're done. Clear your locker and leave my hospital." Marcus looked at her once, said nothing, picked up his bucket, and walked away. If you want to see what happened next, subscribe and like this video, and comment below where you're watching from.
Nobody at Riverside General remembered exactly when the photograph appeared on the third-floor corridor wall. It had been there long enough that the frame had darkened at the corners and the color had shifted toward yellow at the edges. A ribbon-cutting ceremony. A man in a gray suit holding oversized scissors, smiling at something outside the frame. Someone had pressed a sticky note to the bottom glass years ago and written a single word on it in blue ballpoint. Founder. That was all anyone knew. The nurses on the night rotation had their own theories. Sandra, from the billing department, believed the founder had sold the hospital years ago to a corporate group and retired somewhere warm. The head of facilities, a broad man named Terry, was convinced the founder had died and that the hospital was now run entirely by lawyers and accountants who had never once set foot inside the building. The younger staff didn't think about it at all. The hospital functioned, paychecks arrived, that was enough. What none of them knew was that the founder had been mopping their floors for 3 months. Marcus Hale was 51 years old. He was not a tall man. He was not a man who filled rooms with his presence or announced himself when he entered spaces. He had spent the better part of 30 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable in appearance while being entirely precise in action. He wore the same gray uniform as every other member of the janitorial staff. He signed in at 6 a.m., he signed out when his section was finished. He ate lunch alone in the supply corridor on the second floor, sitting on an overturned crate with a sandwich and a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. The notebook was important. He had started it on his first day, not because anyone asked him to, because Marcus had built Riverside General from a single land acquisition and a construction loan 11 years ago. And he understood the difference between what a financial report said and what a building told you when you paid attention to it from the inside. The reports had been telling him for 2 years that Riverside General was performing adequately. The building was telling him something different. Supply closets that should have been stocked were padlocked with inventory sheets that hadn't been updated in weeks. The oncology ward on the 4th floor had submitted 3 equipment requests in 8 months and received responses on none of them. 2 members of the night nursing staff were covering shifts that should have had 4 people because the open positions had been frozen by a budget decision that Marcus could not locate in any document his legal team had sent him. Someone was cutting costs in places that didn't show up cleanly on a balance sheet. Someone who knew exactly where to cut without triggering an audit flag. Director Pauline Graves had been running Riverside General for 4 years. She was efficient in the way that certain people are efficient, by measuring everything that could be measured and quietly ignoring everything that couldn't. Staff satisfaction, patient experience on the lower income wards, the morale of people whose names didn't appear in board presentations. These things did not produce metrics that Graves found useful, and so they did not exist in her operational universe. Marcus had watched her for 3 months.
He had watched her walk past the same underfunded supply station 14 times without stopping. He had watched her approve a renovation budget for the administrative corridor on the second floor, while the request for replacement monitors in the ICU sat unanswered. He had written all of it in the notebook, in small, precise handwriting. He had also watched how she spoke to people.
Not the physicians, not the department heads, the people she considered beneath the threshold of professional courtesy, the cleaning staff, the kitchen workers, the orderlies, the night security guard named Pete who always nodded at Marcus when he passed. Graves spoke to these people the way someone speaks to a vending machine, transactional, impatient, occasionally contemptuous when the machine didn't respond fast enough. Marcus had seen this pattern in 2 other companies he owned before he learned how to hire correctly. He knew exactly what it produced over time. He had 3 months of evidence in a notebook, and he had been deciding quietly for 2 weeks what to do with it. Then Tuesday happened. He had been mopping the 3rd floor corridor at 9 a.m., 40 minutes later than his usual schedule, because a pipe fitting on the 2nd floor needed immediate attention, and Marcus had fixed it himself rather than waiting for the facilities request to process. He was moving the wet floor sign into position when he heard heels on the tile behind him. Graves was walking with 2 senior administrators. She stopped when she reached him, looked at the wet floor sign, looked at him, then looked at her watch with the particular performance of someone who wants witnesses to their impatience. "This section is supposed to be finished before staff arrives. That's been the schedule since before you were hired. I don't have room in this hospital for people who can't follow a basic timetable." She looked at the administrator on her left. "Process the termination this afternoon." Then back to Marcus. "Clear your locker and leave." 12 people heard it. 3 of them looked at the floor. 2 of them looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Pauline Graves for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picked up his mop, set it in the bucket, and walked toward the supply corridor without a word. He did not look angry. He did not look humiliated. He looked like a man who had just made a decision. He cleared his locker at 11:38 a.m. It took 4 minutes. There was not much to clear. The notebook was already in his breast pocket. A spare pair of work gloves, a photograph he had kept taped to the inside of the locker door for 3 months, small, slightly creased at the corner, a woman laughing at something outside the frame. He folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket behind the notebook. Then he closed the locker, set the key on the bench, and walked out through the staff exit on the ground floor. He stood on the pavement outside for a long moment, looked up at the building. 11 floors. The 4th floor window, 3rd from the left, was dark. It was always dark at this time of morning. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been avoiding and has finally decided to stop avoiding. Then he took out his phone and made one call. "It's time," he said. "Set the board meeting for Friday. In person, full attendance required. And tell Gerald I need the original trust documentation on the table before anyone sits down." He hung up, put the phone in his pocket, walked to the modest gray car parked 2 streets away that nobody at Riverside General had ever thought to look at twice, drove away without looking back. Claire Oduya had worked in hospital administration for 6 years and spent the last 4 of them at Riverside General, quietly noticing things that didn't add up. Not dramatically, just small structural oddities that accumulated over time, like water finding cracks. Budget approvals that appeared without clear board authorization.
A vendor termination last year that happened overnight with no paper trail she could locate. A legal correspondence address for ownership inquiries that routed to a firm in the city that specialized in private trust management rather than healthcare administration. She had never pulled the thread seriously because the hospital functioned, and she valued her position, and some threads are better left alone.
But on Tuesday afternoon, 3 hours after she watched a janitor get fired in a third-floor corridor for mopping 40 minutes late, she found herself at her desk pulling the thread. It started with the termination paperwork, standard form, name field, M. Hale. She processed dozens of these. She almost didn't stop. But something about the way the man had looked when Graves dismissed him, not defeated, not angry, something else entirely, something that felt like the opposite of surprise, made her type the name into the hospital's original incorporation records database instead of filing the form immediately. The database was old, poorly maintained. It took 4 minutes to return results. M. Hale Medical Holdings, LLC. Primary trustee and beneficial owner, Marcus C. Hale. She stared at the screen. She opened the original building deed, same name. She opened the founding board minutes from 11 years ago, same name. She found the ribbon-cutting photograph in the archived press folder, digital version, slightly higher resolution than the framed print on the third-floor wall. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the janitorial sign-in sheet from that morning. M. Hale, Station 3B, sign-in 6:02 a.m., sign-out 11:43 a.m. Claire sat back in her chair and did not move for almost a minute. Then she closed every window on her computer and picked up her phone and did not call anyone, because she understood instinctively that whatever was about to happen in this building was already in motion, and that the correct thing to do was to be very still and very quiet until it arrived. Friday came the way significant days often do, unremarkably at first. The board members arrived between 8 and 9 a.m. Graves was told it was a quarterly operational review with representatives from the ownership group, unusual for in-person attendance, but not unprecedented. She wore her best jacket, prepared a presentation on departmental metrics she was proud of, arrived at the boardroom at 9:15, confident in the way people are confident when they have never been seriously challenged. The room was already occupied when she walked in. Gerald Park, the senior partner from the trust's legal firm, sat at the far end of the table. The ownership documentation was arranged in labeled folders at every seat, as requested. The board members were already quiet in a way that Graves registered but did not immediately understand. And at the head of the table, in a dark suit, hands folded, sat the man she had fired in a corridor 4 days ago for mopping 40 minutes late.
Graves stopped walking. Marcus looked at her the same way he had looked at her on Tuesday, steady, unhurried, like a man with nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. "Please sit down, Director Graves," said Gerald. "We have a number of items to work through this morning." She sat, because her legs made the decision before her mind caught up. Marcus did not open with anger. He did not perform the moment. He opened the notebook, the small one from his breast pocket, 3 months of careful handwriting, and he placed it on the table. Then he placed Claire's printed documentation beside it. Then he looked at Graves with an expression that was neither cold nor warm, simply clear. "I spent 3 months in this building," he said. "I want to show you what I found." He went through it methodically. Every supply request ignored, every frozen position, every budget cut routed away from patient care and toward administrative presentation. The board read as he spoke. Nobody interrupted. Graves opened her mouth twice and closed it both times because there was nothing in the room to argue against. It was all there in handwriting from a janitor's cart. When he finished, he closed the notebook. This hospital was built to serve people who needed it. It stopped doing that. That ends today. Graves' exit was administrative, restructured out, quietly and completely and without drama. No shouting match, no security escort, just a formal letter, a clear desk, and a door that closed behind her on a career she had believed was untouchable 48 hours earlier. The most devastating part, the part she would carry longest, was that the man she dismissed in front of 12 people never once raised his voice at her. Not in the corridor, not in the boardroom, not once. That evening, after the board had gone, Marcus walked the floors alone. Not in the suit. He had changed back into plain clothes. He walked the same sections he had mopped for 3 months, stopped at the supply station on the 3rd floor that was already being restocked under emergency authorization he had signed that afternoon, nodded to Pete, the night security guard, who nodded back the same way he always had, without ceremony, without surprise, the nod of one person acknowledging another person, which was all it had ever been. He stopped last on the 4th floor, room 7, the dark window. He stood in the doorway for a long time, not sad exactly, something more resolved than sad. The room was quiet and clean, and exactly as he had always kept it in the 11 years since he had last stood in it with someone else beside him. He had built this place out of love and lost the reason he built it within its own walls. He had stayed away for 11 years because returning meant carrying both things at once, what he had built and what he had lost inside it. The janitor position had been his way of returning without fully arriving, of being present without being seen. Graves had fired him out of casual contempt and accidentally forced him to finally walk back through the front door as himself. He looked at the room for another long moment. Then he turned off the light, walked back to the elevator, and pressed the button for the ground floor. The hospital had work to do. So did he.